Now to tonight's guest. David Kilcullen is one of the world's top counter-insurgency specialists and a former colonel in the Australian Army. He's been an advisor to the head of US forces in Afghanistan, General Petraeus, and is now president and CEO of Qaeda Associates, a strategy consultancy. David Kilcullen joins us from Washington. David Kilcullen, welcome to Late Line.
Hi.
How much more have you learned of the details of this operation? We heard earlier from Craig McMurtry that it appears to have been Navy SEALs and it was just 40 minutes in terms of the operation. We know from President Obama that he was first told of a possible lead since last August.
Yeah, I think your viewers are probably now fairly familiar with the details of the raid. In fact, most Americans are actually waking up to the news because it happened in the middle of the night here. As far as we know, it was about 24 Navy SEALs off a number of helicopters. One helicopter went down in the raid. There was a brief firefight, and after that it took them 3 to 4 hours to confirm that they actually had killed Osama bin Laden before the White House was able to go public with the news.
And, of course, we've also got these reports not confirmed that he was buried at sea in accordance with Islamic law. And, of course, as has been pointed out, that removes all opportunity for a shrine. Do you give credence to those reports?
I do, although I haven't got anything to go on other than the reports themselves at this stage.
Well, as we've heard earlier as well, bin Laden resisted and he was shot. Would the first preference of the Americans have been to actually capture him?
I think that this goes right back to something that President Bush said a couple of days after 9/11, when he referred to that old Wild West wanted poster and said, dead or alive. And I think that bringing Osama bin Laden to justice was the preference, but I think that there wasn't a huge amount of concern either way in terms of whether he was taken alive or killed. I think the fact that he chose to fight indicates that it was very unlikely he was going to be taken alive. It was a very heavily fortified, large, complex compound in the middle of a major Pakistani city. So I think the chance of him being taken alive is fairly slim once the SEAL team closed with that site.
How long do you believe he'd been in Pakistan?
As far as we know, he crossed into Pakistan in December of 2001, straight after the Battle of Tora Bora. We've got no reason to believe that he's left Pakistan in the decade since then.
So you really do believe he's been there for the last 9-10 years?
Yes.
And yet also we know from this that he was not in some remote area. He was 50 k's from Islamabad. He was in a very large compound. He was in a garrison town that was full of military. Is it credible that the Pakistanis didn't know he was there?
This is a question the Pakistanis are really going to have to answer, and a lot of people are asking the same question. I've actually been to Abbottabad a couple of times. It's not only a large city, it has a population of about 1 million people, but it has a major Pakistani military base right there. And it does somewhat stretch credibility to think that it was right under the noses of the Pakistani military, that this very major compound, 8 times larger than any other building site in that part of Abbottabad, was sitting there for the last 5 or 6 years. I think this is a debate that's going to play out in the next few days as the Pakistanis strive to answer some of those questions.
Well, there have been, I suppose, long-running questions, haven't they? I mean, where do you sit? There's the argument that there's complicity. There's the argument also that there's incompetency.
I think there's very little doubt at all that there's complicity from some people in Pakistan with Al-Qaeda, with the Pakistani and Afghan Taliban. The question that has always been open to debate is how high up the chain the direction goes within Pakistan to give that cooperation to those militant organizations, so that maybe it's rogue elements of different organizations in Pakistan, maybe it's individuals, or maybe it goes right up to the top. And that's something that, again, is an unresolved question for a lot of people.
How high do you think it goes?
Well, certainly in terms of support for the Afghan Taliban, I've seen evidence of relatively high-level support. But frankly, at this point, it's an even different level of question, given that relations between Pakistan and the United States have been at an extremely low ebb for the last few months after a CIA contractor, Raymond Davis, was put on trial for shooting two Pakistani men who attacked him in the street in Lahore, which is a major city in the Punjab. And really that's led to, I would say, the lowest ebb to date in Pakistani-US relationship.
Well, there's no
So
question
this
of that, is
part
there?
Of a much broader picture.
Well, I was going to say,
sorry?
there's no question of that. That would seem to be a complete example of a complete lack of trust. The fact that it seems clear the Americans did not tell the Pakistanis what they were doing on Pakistani soil.
As far as I'm aware, President Obama called the President of Pakistan as part of a series of calls that he made to world leaders after the attack went down on bin Laden's compound. So yes, that would certainly not be indicative of a close alliance relationship. Let's put it that way.
So how do you think Pakistan will respond to this? Because we've got the former president, we've got General Pervez Musharraf, he's saying that it's a violation of sovereignty, and yet we've got the current administration saying, in essence, we support it and we need to move on and not worry about who did what. But a violation of sovereignty is a very large claim.
This is a claim that various leaders within Pakistan have made for some time, in particular about the uninhabited drone strikes that have been going on inside Pakistan for a number of years now. I think what ex-President Musharraf thinks is somewhat less important at this point than what the elected government thinks. And I think that this is an issue that's going to play out within both the debate inside Pakistan and relations with the external world. I would just point to another issue, though, which is that Osama bin Laden is a relatively popular figure in Pakistan, and in some parts of the Pakistani community, it's likely there's going to be some unrest and perhaps some violence across Pakistan as a result of this. One of the impacts that that's likely to have is on supplies going to Afghanistan. About 80% of the supplies that are used by US and allied forces inside Afghanistan come through supply routes through Pakistan. So that could have a significant short-term operational impact.
You say short-term, so how serious do you see that risk of unrest and ongoing unrest in Pakistan?
I think Pakistan is already subject to such serious unrest that this is going to be the icing on the cake, if you like. I don't think it's going to change the operational situation too much long-term. I guess I would say that at the strategic level, this has been a terrible year for Al-Qaeda. Not only last night did they lose the figurehead and inspirational character of Osama bin Laden, but the grievance that has been driving Al-Qaeda since the early 1990s, the oppressive regimes across the Middle East and North Africa, that whole grievance has been evaporating for the last 3 or 4 months. So at a time when you would think that Al-Qaeda would be wanting to get on the front foot, to get out and to get involved in some way in what's going on in the Middle East and North Africa, this may cause them to turn inward and think about succession to Osama bin Laden and how they're going to take the movement forward. I think this is a time to ratchet up the pressure and keep the pressure on all these groups rather than to rest on our laurels, if you like.
So it would seem clear, though, that if there's a risk of unrest, certainly a risk of further damage to the US-Pakistani relationship, all of that, they're all risks that the US considered were worth taking, were worth the price.
Absolutely. I think the other risk that we should be very aware of is the risk that we'll see people saying, well, this is closure now, this is the end, and there's really no need for us to continue to care about stability and development and humanitarian issues inside Afghanistan. We can just leave now. And I think we should remember that it was the precipitate departure in the early 1990s after the Soviet war that led to this whole thing in the first place. And we should also remember that after 2001, the failure to engage in peace building and reconciliation and all the most important aspects of national reintegration in Afghanistan was one of the reasons why the Taliban came back so strongly after 2001. So I think, again, this is a time to engage in a bit of forward-leaning work to try and finalise a lot of this development and peace-building work rather than to sort of take a bat and ball and go home.
Well, indeed, do you fear the bat and ball? Because already we've heard this morning in Washington and looking in the newspapers that this gives some momentum to President Obama's plans to start the drawdown of troops in just 2 months' time.
Well, it is very convenient timing for the July 2011 deadline for the beginning of the withdrawal. There's been some debate here about whether that's going to be merely a symbolic withdrawal or whether there'll be some very substantial troop reductions in the next few months. I think this does certainly lend weight to the idea that it'll be more substantial rather than just symbolic. We'll have to see how things play out. I should remind people, and I'm sure that our ABC viewers don't need much reminding, but we're getting into the spring offensive in Afghanistan right now, and violence has been going up for the last month or so. It's going to continue to rise into the summer in Afghanistan, and I think this is a factor that needs to be taken into account when we consider how many troops are needed on the ground.
You talk about Al-Qaeda perhaps turning inwards and certainly looking at succession. What is the future for Al-Qaeda? Is this a game changer?
I think that to some extent it is. Osama bin Laden is not the commander-in-chief of Al-Qaeda. He's been described as the inciter-in-chief by Michael Scheuer, a prominent terrorism analyst. He's more of an inspirational figure, a figurehead who inspires people across the movement, and he remains extremely popular in certain circles in the jihadist community. So I think that it's certainly going to be a blow. The fact that there's no grave to become a shrine is also going to be important in that. But I think that this certainly doesn't put an end to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is much bigger than just one person, and we really need to see what happens in the next few months before we can make really firm judgments about the future of the movement.
And the risk of retaliation, how well placed is Al-Qaeda, how well resourced is it to launch a full-scale retaliatory attack right now?
I think it's likely that we will see a short-term spike in attempted terrorist activity. I would agree with your previous person that was on about Indonesia being a possible location. But I think, in general, Al-Qaeda has always maintained the intention to carry out terrorist attacks at the highest possible level, so that what we may see are sort of short-term, half-baked, not very well-considered attacks, perhaps even copycat or spontaneous attacks. And I think that that will tend to have an overall damaging effect on the network because it tends to destroy cells that are half ready to launch attacks and so on. I think we'll see that in Afghanistan. We may see a spike in Taliban attacks related to this, given the very important improvements in security in the south of the country in the last 3 or 4 months. I can only see that resulting in more Taliban casualties rather than improved Taliban position.
David Kilcullen, we'll have to leave it there, but so many questions after such extraordinary events. Many thanks for talking to Lateline.
Thanks, Ali.